Hi, I'm Eddie Ungless. I use he, him pronouns from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm here to talk about a paper with Bjorn Ross and Alasha, who are also here today. So yeah, I'll just start by saying that the original title for this paper was Cartoons and Cock, and you'll see why, but we vetoed it. We didn't want to be too controversial. And just as a warning, some of the images contained in this presentation are offensive in terms of the stereotypes that they propagate and in terms of nudity. Also, I have censored out the cocks for your sake. So text image models are getting widely used. They're getting used in commercial spaces as well. Levi's recently suggested they were going to be using AI models to increase diversity of their product images. Shutterstock and OpenAI have a deal. They're going to start doing text to image generated content as well. So yeah, basically we can envisage a future where it becomes really commonplace for people to have a text prompt, put it into this model and produce an image. That has great potential for creating really diverse imagery, but the problem is that this is the kind of thing that the models are doing currently. So this is an example of when you put transgender women into the stable diffusion model. So you can see that there is an element of fetishization in terms of nudity. There's a risk of identities being erased. So the black square shows that the model said there was a risk of not safe for work content and they couldn't output an image. And that happened most commonly for the transgender images in the work I'm going to talk about. And then there's an element of potentially stereotyping, so perhaps like hyperfemininity in trans women. And yeah, so these kind of images prompted us to want to investigate this topic. So yeah, potential for widespread use, exclusion of minority voices in tech in general, which has obviously been spoken about today. And then also we wanted to actually talk with the community, like the non-cisgender people in AI, because there's a lack of participant research, obviously being remedied by many of the people in the room today, but in general. And yeah, harms we were concerned about were exposure to offensive content, the deliberate creation of hateful content as well, and the reinforcement of stereotypes by the images produced by these text-to-image models. We used a mixed methods approach. We annotated model output, we surveyed the community, and I did a small number of interviews as well, and I'll talk about each of them in turn. So first of all, we created lots and lots of prompts using a range of non-cisgender and cisgender gender identity terms, combined in various ways with the choice of pronouns to create 231 prompts. In the paper, you'll see the motivation for how we decided which terms would go with which in a hope to be what was, I hope, as sensitive as possible to the different identities listed. The models we tested were Stable Diffusion and DALL-E 2 as kind of cutting edge text image models, and then also DALL-E Mini, which is really widely used. And I spent a nice fun summer digging about on that. So we included that as well. So the reason that we call this paper Stereotypes and Smut is because that's really what we saw. So this is an example of a transgender woman at a business event. That was one of the prompts. And I want to make it super clear here that like masculine trans women are still incredible and to be celebrated and to be represented by these models. I don't want to stop the models producing images like this of trans women with some maybe stereotypically masculine features in terms of muscles or broad shoulders or whatever. But that's not what all trans women look like. And if this is the only way that trans women are represented, it's not actually a true representation of the community. And this is some smut. So this is what happens when you put in transgender men tour and enjoy the public park. And I'll contrast that with men tour and enjoy the public park. Most people are clothed. There are no horrible AI renderings of genitals, which I've saved you from here, because there was a lot of that. So yeah, we kind of compared the levels of smut. So as identified by our annotators, we asked them to label for nudity. And you can see that the two identities that had the most nudity were, or the two kind of groups of identities were two-spirit identities and trans identities. Interestingly, explicitly cisgender images also produced quite a lot of smut. And I think that was just because of the token, the subtoken gender being present. It made it act more like the images which explicitly referenced transgender. Whereas when we look at implicitly cisgender identities, so we don't mention it at all and cisgender is assumed, it's the norm, we have quite low levels of nudity. So yeah, that was a quick overview of the findings from the annotation task. And then we also conducted a survey of non-cisgender members of the AI community. We can contextualize harms in some potential commercial uses that had been proposed by OpenAI, and we asked them to rate and describe likely harms and also rate their satisfaction with some heuristic solutions that we're likely to see. So things that are currently being done with other technologies where you ignore certain words, you add warning labels, these kind of simple post hoc solutions. There was pretty widespread rejection of the heuristics. Some of the things people talked about were being concerned about being erased. It wasn't completely homogenous though. So here's an example of rated satisfaction in terms of appending a warning label, which is something that some of the models do now. A lot of people were very unsatisfied with that, seen by a low rating, but there were a group who were kind of okay with that. So it's not like a one solution will be great for everyone, but some of the proposed solutions were pretty unanimously hated. So just ignoring identity terms like transgender in order to try and not produce stereotyped images, that was pretty unanimously rejected, somewhat unsurprisingly. So yeah, some of the things that people suggested to make it to improve the way these models represent non-cisgender people are collecting more diverse, more representative data, not just in terms of gender identity, but also in terms of different aspects of people's identities. But this also raised a concern around the safety ramifications of having a huge data set of labeled non-cisgender individuals. So the most obvious solution of collecting more data isn't actually as simple as it seems. Oh. And something people called for was post hoc modification of images. So they wanted to be able to add details at the end to change the way that a particular identity was being represented. But this obviously has the potential to be misused to create more offensive images. And then finally, we interviewed 4 individuals who'd responded to our survey, picking out individuals from diverse backgrounds to try and have diverse perspectives represented. It was an unstructured interview looking at the problems and potentials of these technologies and specifically focusing on how people would like to be represented. So the way I see the kind of journey in this paper is we had our assumptions about some potential harms. We looked at them in the output, and then we asked the community about in the survey about those potential harms. And then in the interview, we followed up with, what are the benefits you can foresee these models having? A couple of the key themes were basically the concerns about the harmful output, a call for community-led development, not just being involved at the final stages, but actually being there at the table the entire time. They felt that was really important so it would not be an exploitative relationship. And there was a call for more need for transparency and regulation. And please do read the paper for more of the themes that got pulled out. Something I really, really loved was one of the interviewees said that these technologies have the potential to portray queerness in ways we haven't even thought of. These technologies do have the potential to represent new identities people hadn't thought of, or represent themselves in ways that they couldn't necessarily manifest in reality. But unfortunately, at the moment, the technologies are basically just reproducing stale stereotypes, and they're not living up to that creative potential. So yeah. Just to repeat, the heuristics were widely rejected, and there was a call for better data and customization. Moving forward, it would be great to have more non-white, non-Western perspectives. Unfortunately, the survey, the majority of respondents were white and Western. I'd love to see and take part and do more work focusing on trans women who are a particularly vulnerable part of the community. And yeah, I just want to re-emphasize what everyone in the room already knows, which is the need to lift minority voices in NLP research. This is a quote from one of the reviews, and I'm salty, so I'm including it here, which is, what I find missing a bit is the cisgender view as a comment on a paper about non-cisgender people. So yeah, it's not, I think, yeah, sometimes maybe in a bubble, I can take it for granted that of course people will realize this is important, and sometimes people don't. Anyway, yeah, thank you to my co-authors, Bjorn and Anna, and my funders, and thank you all. And yeah, any questions I could take now or just in general, I like to think I'm approachable. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Eddie? Also. Thanks so much for this, Eddie. This is incredibly cool. I'm curious about something you mentioned. You mentioned at one point in the presentation that also the cisgender images tended to skew towards being sexually explicit because of the inclusion of the word gender in there. And so I'm really curious about that in terms of what the implications are for gender itself as a term being sexualized, having a strong correlation with sexual content in these models. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts or if there were any reflections from your participants as well, the folks that you interviewed, about how more or better data could help kind of maybe reduce that particular association, if that is the primary way that we could obviate that. Because of course, as we know, that's a big problem with algorithms already for queer and trans people, is coding our content as sexually explicit by nature. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just to the first point, we're not 100% certain as to why there were such high levels of nudity for the phrase cisgender, but our theory is that it is because of the association with gender and transgender. Like, something I thought was interesting is the levels of nudity for transgender men, and it feels like the gender being included as a subtoken just caused so much nudity, but nudity associated with porn of trans women. So the men were being represented with sort of like the anatomy of a cis man, perhaps. And like, yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting that it sort of it managed to confuse itself by the inclusion of that term, essentially. It was surprisingly inclusive. Yeah, and in terms of creating better training data, I think that it's tricky because certain communities are represented in very sort of stereotyped ways. So something that one of the interviewees spoke about was the fact that like certain third and minority and marginalized genders from around the world might only be represented in the context of being sort of like this ethnic other, associated with perhaps a particular set of spiritual or religious beliefs, are not represented as like people living lives and just doing kind of like their daily activities. So yeah, like even if we do try and gather more data, there are many kind of factors we need to think about to make sure that it's quality representative data, it's not othering. And I think the levels of pornography, the reason I think that's relevant to this levels of pornography conversation is because like, yeah, on the internet, so often queer identities are represented as a fetish. And like, you know, I think many of us have lived experiences of being fetishized for our identities. And like, so yeah, even if you get more data on these identities, if it's from people who are if it's from out with the community looking kind of at us, it's not necessarily an improvement. And that relates to both fetishization, but also exotification and these kind of issues as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Eddie. Sorry, I think we only had time for one question, but I'm sure all of our authors in this session are happy to talk offline about more questions. So I think we are going to move on to our first keynote session, and give me a second to transition to the other side of the room.